Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topic for tonight is what should Biden do about the kingly presidency? That is, the kingly presidency which has been handed to him by the Supreme Court. So let's begin to sketch out the kingly presidency. And then we'll begin to ask the questions, of what Biden can do about it. Because he presumably doesn't like it, even though but he at this point is the first beneficiary of the decision by the Supreme Court to give the president a very high level, of immunity for acts performed by the president. I'm going to share a piece called "The 5-Alarm Fire for Democracy" by Judd Legum, that appeared on his blog, Popular Information. Which, if I'm not mistaken, is a Substack blog. It was written on July 2nd, 2024. And there, of course, are crowds gathering for the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. On Monday, 6 members of the Supreme Court granted Donald Trump and every future president broad criminal immunity. The court found that as president, Trump was free to use his official powers to commit crimes, considering that the president of the United States is the most powerful position in the world. This is a breathtaking pronouncement. Writing in dissent, Justice Sotomayor details the implications. When the President of the United States uses his official powers in any way, under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune. Supreme Court invented this new kind of presidential immunity 235 years after the Constitution was ratified, and it lacks any grounding in the Constitution's text. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, cites the need for the president to take, quote, bold and unhesitating action, unquote, without, quote, undue caution, unquote. So just a couple of comments on this. There's no textual basis for this, in the Constitution. Judicial fundamentalism or textualism be damned. 6 conservatives on the court, but did not hesitate to legislate presidential immunity without any textual basis in the Constitution, because they perceive a need for the president to take, quote, bold and unhesitating action, unquote, without, quote, undue caution. So this finding is based on their perception, on their judgment. It is not based on the Constitution. Justice Sotomayor explains that the Constitution contains provisions granting various forms of criminal immunity to federal officials, but the President of the United States was not included. Quote, the framers clearly knew how to provide for immunity from prosecution. They did provide a narrow immunity for legislatures in the speech or debate clause, Article 1, paragraph 6, or Section 6, Clause 1. Quote, senators and representatives shall in all cases, except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place, unquote. They did not extend the same or similar immunity to presidents. I wonder why not. Indeed, the Constitution specifically contemplates the criminal prosecution of a former president. The Constitution states that even after a president is impeached, convicted, and removed from office, the former president, quote, shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law, unquote. Trump's own lawyers during his second impeachment trial argued that senators should not convict him because if there was evidence supporting wrongdoing, Trump could be criminally prosecuted for the events of January 6th after leaving office. So his own lawyers knew this. His own lawyers knew there was no protection in the Constitution, but the 6 conservatives on the Supreme Court claim to know that the Constitution protects the president, that there is immunity that is granted by the Constitution. Wow. In Federalist number 69, Alexander Hamilton wrote that the president would be, quote, liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law, unquote. Hamilton, of course, was talking under the Constitution. This, Hamilton wrote, is the distinction between the, quote, King of England, unquote, who was sacred and invulnerable, quote, unquote, and the, quote, President of the United States, unquote. Hamilton, one of the key fathers of the Constitution, stated this was a key difference between the King of England and the President of the United States. Giving Trump everything he wants. The majority attempts to frame its decision as a compromise because it states that presidents do not have immunity for unofficial acts. But that was the position of Trump's own lawyers, so it is hardly a concession. It also creates a very narrow definition of unofficial acts. Quotes around, okay, the unofficial. The president is acting in official capacity as long as the president's actions are, quote, not, but manifestly or palpably beyond his authority, unquote. Further, when making that evaluation as to whether an action is official, okay, or unofficial, quote, courts may not inquire into the motives of the president, unquote. That's why if the president accepts $10 million to issue a pardon, the president cannot be prosecuted criminally for issuing the pardon because the president's, quote, the motive, unquote, for the pardon, an official act, is off limits. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that, okay, absolutely ridiculous. And especially according to the Constitution, because the president is not allowed to accept any bribes. He's not allowed to accept any bribes in the context of the Domestic Emoluments Clause. If the president accepts $10 million to issue a pardon, he is certainly accepting a bribe for issuing the pardon. That goes beyond his authority. He has no authority to take a pardon. Yet the Supreme Court stated this as an example of where prosecutors could not go. The majority then states that when the president's actions fall within the office's, quote, conclusive and preclusive, unquote, authority, the president has absolute immunity. And pardons are an area where the president has that kind of authority. So the president has absolute immunity in conflict with the Domestic Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. The majority uses this standard to declare, quote, Trump is absolutely immune from prosecution for the alleged conduct involving his discussions with the Justice Department officials, unquote, which is part of the federal indictment against Trump related to January 6th. Notably, the majority does not state what, if any, of Trump's actions that form the basis of the criminal charges are unofficial acts. The heart of the majority decision is that for all other official acts, the president has, quote, at least presumptive immunity, unquote. Okay, that means that when anybody looks at these acts, there's a presumption that the president, okay, is immune. And so in trying to prosecute for these acts, the prosecution would have to overcome the burden of the presumption, okay, of immunity. The majority finds, going on with the article, the president is immune unless, quote, the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose, quote, no danger of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch, unquote. As Justice Sotomayor notes in a dissent, however, quote, it is hard to imagine a criminal prosecution for a president's official acts that would pose no dangers of intrusion on presidential authority, okay, in the majority's eyes, unquote. In fact, I think it's very hard to imagine, because if there were any kind of criminal prosecution, that would surely require the president to go to court, and it would be an imposition on the president's time. And of course, it might weaken the perception of authority of the president. So the very act of prosecution, it seems to me, poses a danger of intrusion to the presidential authority of the president. So they're practically defining the idea, okay, of immunity as equivalent to a president's official acts, as one of the defining aspects of the official acts of the president. The majority decision, in fact, explains at length why criminally prosecuting Trump for pressuring former Vice President Pence to overturn the legitimate results of the election and install Trump for a second term may be an, quote, intrusion on presidential authority, unquote. Yeah, it certainly would have been an intrusion on presidential authority. All I have to say is, so what? Is the only value that we think about the authority of the president? Or do we also think about whether the president is committing crimes or not? Do we also think that the president should not be above the law? Here's a quote. This is a quote from the majority opinion. The president may frequently rely on the vice president in his capacity as president of the Senate to advance the president's agenda in Congress. Oh, also, by the way, that is not in the Constitution. It is not in the Constitution that the vice president, in his capacity as president of the Senate, has to advance, the agenda of the president. I mean, that's politics. That's not constitutional law. When the Senate is divided, for instance, the vice president's tie-breaking vote may be crucial for confirming the nominees of the president, passing laws, that align with the policies of the president. Well, that's true, but that's not a requirement of the office. It's not a constitutional requirement of the office. It doesn't state in the Constitution that when there's a tie-breaking vote, that the vice president is duty-bound to confirm the nominees of the president, or is duty-bound to pass laws that align with the policies of the president. That's not in the Constitution. But the majority goes on, applying a criminal prohibition to the president's conversations discussing such matters with the vice president, even though they concern his role as president of the Senate, may well hinder the president's ability to perform his constitutional functions. Well, they may do that, but they also certainly hinder the president in performing functions that have nothing to do with his constitutional duty. In this case, the functions had to do with the president committing a crime of election interference. As if that were not sufficient going on. The majority also reserves the right to scrap the idea of a, quote, a presumption, unquote, of immunity, and just declare that the president is immune from criminal prosecution for all official acts at some future date. And then, of course, would have to decide what's an official act and what's an unofficial act. And I suppose if the president committed a crime, some judges would ex post facto rule that he wasn't committing, he wasn't doing an official act, that the crime was unofficial. Justice Sotomayor sums up the impact of the majority decision. Quote, today's court has replaced the presumption of equality before the law with the presumption that the president is above the law for all of his official acts, unquote. Absolutely correct. What happens now to Trump's case and the nation? The majority's decision does not end the criminal case against Trump related to his actions on and around January 6, 2021, but the case is on life support. The Supreme Court remanded the case back to the district court to apply the decision and determine whether any of the charges against Trump survive. If the district court finds some of the criminal charges against Trump can proceed, Trump can appeal and eventually find his way back to the Supreme Court. At a minimum, this will delay any potential trial far beyond the 2024 election. If Trump wins the election, he can direct the Justice Department to drop the case. And even if Trump loses the election, is a majority of the Supreme Court prepared to say that Trump should be tried for any of his conduct related to January 6, 2021? This point, it seems doubtful. But the implications for Trump's criminal prosecution pale in comparison to the long-term impact on the nation. The court has now declared, for the first time in history, that the most powerful official in the United States can become a law unto himself, unquote. Justice Ketanji Jackson wrote in a separate dissent, quote, presidents alone are now free to commit crimes when they are on the job, while all other Americans must follow the law in all aspects of their lives, whether personal or professional, unquote. There's an interesting implication of this, too. What happens if somebody works for a president and the president orders that person to commit a crime, when they're on the job? So what happens if the person who is on the job then refuses to commit that crime? Then presumably, under the rules of the Supreme Court, the president would then be free to dismiss the underling for disobedience, for insubordination. This, I suppose, would be especially true if the president were to order the underling and say that he will give him a pardon. What if in that instance the subordinate says, I'm still not going to commit a crime for you. I'm still not going to commit a crime for you. So would the president be justified in that respect, in firing the person who refuses to commit the crime? Does the president have the authority to insist that others commit crimes when they are on the job? This goes beyond the question of the immunity of the president. it goes to the question of the authority of the president. Did the Supreme Court decide that the president has that kind of authority? We'll come back to that issue later. Okay. Okay, but you see the nightmare here. But next, yes, as long as I'm here, I realize that I haven't yet shared this on Facebook. So excuse me for just a minute while I do. Okay, so that decision sure is a 5-alarm fire for democracy, I think. Okay. So, Steve Wolfbrand says, strange times indeed. Says hello. Evelina says, Supreme Court ruling applies to every president, no matter the party from now on. Right. It ruling applies to Joe Biden. He now has the extreme powers that were granted by the Supreme Court, and we'll get into the implications of that. But here's a piece about screaming the quiet part. Trump advisors say he's ready to embrace king-like powers. And there's a kind of a mugshot of Donald Trump speaking during a debate with President Joe Biden in Atlanta, Georgia on June 27, 2024. That was a disastrous debate for Joe Biden. The U.S. Supreme Court's immunity decision has reportedly emboldened the presumptive GOP nominee to pursue his far-right agenda and authoritarian aims without fear of punishment or restraint. This piece is by Jake Johnson on July 2nd, 2024, yesterday. A presumptive Republican nominee, Donald Trump, who was pledged to be a dictator on day one, quote unquote, for the day one, that is, if elected to another 4 years in the White House, is reportedly preparing to exploit the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling Monday that current and former presidents are entitled to sweeping immunity from criminal prosecution. Citing some unnamed advisors to the former president, Axios reported Tuesday that if Trump is reelected in November, quote, he, quote, plans to immediately test the boundaries of presidential and governing power, knowing the restraints of Congress and the courts are dramatically looser than during his first term, unquote. Quote, they're screaming the quiet part, and yet Democrats are mostly focused on renominating a sundowning 81-year-old, losing to him in key swing state polls, unquote. The Levers, David Sirota wrote in response to Axios reporting, referring to President Joe Biden. Facing mounting calls to drop his re-election campaign following his disastrous debate performance against Trump last week, Biden said in an address following the Supreme Court decision in Trump versus United States that the ruling means, quote, there are virtually no limits on what a president can do, unquote. Okay. I wonder about that. And the reason why, I wonder about that, if a president lays down a new law, in an executive order, then the president would be legislating That kind of activity by the president is not part of his official duty. According to the Constitution, separation of powers would still apply here. The president has no authority to legislate. For that matter, the Supreme Court doesn't have any authority to legislate, which is what they were doing here, by the way. So certainly, there would still be limits on what a president can do. But what this paragraph is saying, what Biden thinks, is that if it happened, okay, that a president were to legislate, were to define a new law, okay, in an executive order, then the president would be immune from prosecution for that. Well, again, that might be true, but still, the president doesn't have the authority to legislate. So, would all the other officials in government follow along with the new legislation of the president when they know the president doesn't have the authority to legislate? What if the president were challenged, okay, in the Supreme Court with the simple argument that, hey, the president doesn't have the authority to legislate? Would the Supreme Court then order the president to cancel the legislation? And if the president refused, what would the Supreme Court do then? Would they declare the president in contempt of the Supreme Court? And who would enforce the contempt citation? Going on with the piece. Here's another quote from Biden. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential power as I have for 3.5 years, said Biden. Well, he's done more than that. He's even where the president doesn't have any limits on his power, okay, as in the case, okay, of the parliamentarian a few years ago. Joe Biden did not tell people in the Senate, did not remind people that the parliamentarian was only an advisor and they didn't have to follow the advice of the parliamentarian, but he said instead, I respect the parliamentarian. Anyway, going on, quote, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. But will they be free to ignore the Constitution? Will they be free to ignore the separation of powers? That's a key question. Is the Supreme Court saying that they will be immune to prosecution if they exceed the authority of the president according to the Constitution? Well, the Supreme Court seems to be saying that if they're doing that, okay, an official act. But is it really, okay, an official act if they exceed the authority of their office? So that gets us into this particular conundrum again and the circular nature of the reasoning being applied here. Going on, among the steps Trump, who celebrated the ruling, intends to take swiftly upon assuming office following a possible November victory, according to Axios, is, quote, setting up, quote, vast camps, unquote, quote, to deport millions of people, unquote, moving to, quote, fire potentially tens of thousands of civil servants, unquote, and replace them with pre-vetted, pre-vetted loyalists, okay, unquote. This, by the way, would be a violation of the civil service law. Does the president have the authority to violate the civil service law? Now, he may be immune from prosecution for violating the civil service law. Okay, but is he immune from other people trying to stop him from violating the civil service law? What if the tens of thousands of civil servants simply refuse to go? Say you violated the civil service law, we're not leaving. And what if they're supported by other civil servants who do things like cut their paychecks and will say, well, these guys are right. This is a violation of the civil service law. We're not going to obey the president when he orders us to violate the civil service law. Anyway, going on. And centralizing, quote, power over the Justice Department, unquote, which the former president has repeatedly threatened to wield against his political opponents. Well, of course, since the former president, if he wins, in this case, specifically Joe Biden, would also be immune from prosecution according to the court, would Trump refuse to prosecute him? Or would he leave him alone? I don't know. Somehow I doubt that he would. And if the Supreme Court happened to object to it, I think I know what would happen to the Supreme Court. I would think they would find the members of the Supreme Court would find themselves occupying a cold cell somewhere in the federal prison system. Trump has also pledged to gut environmental rules, which the Supreme Court also targeted in recent rulings, and rammed through climate-wrecking drilling projects, moves backed by the powerful oil and gas industry that's helping finance his campaign. Thanks to Monday's Supreme Court ruling, Trump could pursue his plans without fear of punishment or restraint. And Elizabeth Warren tweeted, it's coming fast and furious if he's elected, being a dictator on day one, swapping civil servants for pre-vetted loyalists, quote unquote, threatening to, quote, target and even imprison critics, unquote, pardoning insurrectionists, jacking up prices with new tariffs, and more. And there's Trump giving his best imitation of Benito Mussolini with a crown on his head. Beyond the curtain, the imperial presidency in waiting, this is from Axios, Trump would come to office with a cabinet and staff pre-vetted for loyalty and a fully compliant Republican coalition in Congress, devoid, well, the caption doesn't go further than that. Well, Trump made his support for such actions clear well before the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on Monday. The decision is likely to embolden, just imagine, it's only Wednesday. I mean, it seems like a long time since this decision was handed down. Is likely to embolden the twice impeached former president who, since leaving office, has been indicted by a federal grand jury on election subversion charges and convicted of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. But those were, I have to add, certainly those were unofficial acts of the president because he wasn't even president yet. So you can hardly call those official acts of the president. So it seems like he shouldn't be immune in relation to the 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. The high courts are ideologically divided, and that's fair to say. 6-3 decision in the immunity case has already impacted both legal proceedings, with Manhattan prosecutors agreeing Tuesday with the former president's request to delay his criminal sentencing on the 34 felony charges as the judge on the case examines whether the Supreme Court's ruling has any bearing on the conviction. Well, some people seem to think it's good, to delay, because, just for the purpose of examining whether the decision has any bearing on the conviction. But I don't see how it can have any bearing on the conviction. And if he was sentenced now, well, I just don't know from a political point of view what's best, to sentence him now or wait until September. There are many people who were celebrating, the delay in sentencing because they expect it to come in the latter part of September. And they hope it will hurt Trump's campaign for the presidency, but I think it's debatable about whether it would hurt his campaign still more then, or whether it would hurt his campaign now to be sentenced. But of course, he wouldn't go to prison anyway. He wouldn't go to prison anyway, because even if he was sentenced, he would appeal, and the appeal would take some time. So I guess he wouldn't be going immediately to prison. He wouldn't be stopped from campaigning. In the separate election subversion case, Supreme Court's ruling further pushes back a trial, as the judge now has to determine which of the actions described in the indictment qualify as, quote, official, unquote, duties that, according to the High Court's right-wing supermajority, are entitled to, quote, absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. Quote, so yes, all this will delay Trump's trial. In that sense, he gets what he craved, unquote. Michael Waldman, president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice, wrote on Monday, and quote again, but the implications are far worse for the structure of American self-government. Quote, we read sonorous language in the majority opinion that, quote, the president is not above the law, unquote. Well, they just said he was above the law. Waldman added, quote, but just in time for Independence Day, the Supreme Court brings us closer to having a king again, unquote. I think that comment is perfectly well justified. Liberal Justice Sotomayor wrote in her dissent against Sunday's decision that the Supreme Court's majority has effectively endorsed assassinations of political rivals, orchestration of a military coup to remain in power, and the acceptance of bribes in exchange for pardons as legitimate and unprosecutable uses of presidential authority. Well, is that really true? I suppose it is. It depends upon how he frames the actions. In other words, if he were to assassinate his rivals and provide some story about how they were plotting against the Republic or something like that, his actions may be, deemed to have official status. If he orchestrated a military coup to remain in power, I suppose if the president were to give the excuse that, well, the election was rigged and that's why he lost, so he's perfectly justified to orchestrate, a military coup. And then there's the question of the acceptance of bribes in exchange for pardons. And then, Sotomayor cited these actions as basically legitimate and unprosecutable uses of presidential authority. But I don't know if the court really decided that they were legitimate uses of presidential authority. There's a difference between being a legitimate use of presidential authority and an unprosecutable use of presidential authority. Quote, the relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably, unquote. Sotomayor wrote, quote again, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. Slate legal journalist Mark Joseph Stern echoed Sotomayor, writing that, quote, it is unclear after Monday's decision what constitutional checks remain to stop any president from assuming dangerous and monarchical powers that are anathema to representative government, unquote. Quote again, the immediate impact of the court sweeping decision will be devastating enough, allowing Donald Trump to evade accountability for the most destructive and criminal efforts he took to overthrow the 2020 election. But the long-term impact is even more harrowing, unquote, Stern wrote, quote again, all future presidents will enter office with the knowledge they are protected from prosecution for even the most appalling and dangerous abuses of power, so long as they insist they were seeking to carry out their duties as they understood them, unquote. Yes, and remember, there's a presumption, if it seems to be an official duty, there's a presumption that they have immunity in that case, and the prosecution has the burden of proof. Quote again, the framers of the Constitution, wary of reestablishing the monarchy they overthrew, carefully limited the chief executive's powers, unquote. That's a true historical statement. That's what they did. That's what they intended in the Constitution. Stern added, quote, and 6 justices just crowned him king, unquote. Not quite. Not quite. There are various reasons why not. And we'll get into those as we move down the line. But now I want to switch to squirrely pepper lifestyle. Okay, now I want to switch to a very short video that makes a distinction which is very important. The video is from Justin King. Why can't I find it? I thought it was here. Nope. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can get this. Okay. That's certainly not the video I intended. Let me see if it somehow got there. Okay, here's the video that I meant, but let me share it for you because it's not shared yet. It's from Justin King, who otherwise known, as Bo. And the title is, Let's Talk About King Biden Embracing His Villain Arc.
It has to be defeated at the ballot box. Even AOC's move. She's saying she's going to file articles of impeachment.
Sorry, that's in the middle. I meant to start this.
Well, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So today we are going to talk about the effects of the Supreme Court decision on the Biden administration, because there's a lot of talk about what Biden can do now because of his newfound immunity, which is being confused with a.
In fact, I talked about that actually last night, if you recall. I think I also talked about it on Monday. Yes, I did on Monday. So I talked actually quite a lot about what Biden can do, okay, with the immunity that he's now inherited.
Authority. There's a lot of conversation, and a lot of it's a joke, and the joke is fine, about, let's just call it drastic actions that King Biden might undertake if he truly embraced Dark Brandon and started his villain arc. Here's the thing. The Supreme Court decision provides immunity for actions, not authority.
So Justin is here making the distinction that I spoke of earlier. Okay. Okay, and in this I was reflecting what Justin had said, because he brought home, okay, the distinction between immunity, okay, and authority.
One of the first rules of command is never give an order that won't be obeyed. Sure, Biden could, in theory, order these drastic actions, but that doesn't actually give him the authority to do it.
So the point is, okay, that obedience to his order, okay, is not automatic. I mean, this is not a machine, okay, we're dealing with. Okay, he won't have the legal authority just because he's president. His immunity doesn't increase his legal authority to do certain things.
Which means those orders may not be followed by the people under him. Why? And this is an important distinction. Biden staffed his administration with people who actually respect the U.S. Constitution. So odds are they're not going to follow it.
So, since they're people who respect the Constitution, if Biden gave them orders, okay, that were unconstitutional, Justin is saying, they likely would not follow the orders. But what if Biden gave them orders that were clearly unconstitutional, but were, okay, in the service of stopping Trump, okay, from becoming a dictator here in the United States? Would the same people who respect, okay, the Constitution, would they think, well, the Constitution is not a suicide pact? Or would they stick to their strict adherence to the Constitution, okay, even knowing that it would doom the United States to a dictatorship? Just asking the question. It's an important question.
They wouldn't follow the order. He has immunity, but not authority.
Okay. What if Biden were to order people to arrest and jail Donald Trump, okay, on grounds that he was plotting to convert the United States into a dictatorship? There's all kinds of evidence that he's been planning to do that, including his own public statements. So, doesn't Biden have the power to protect the Constitution, okay, against a revolutionary? What Trump plans to do is a revolution. He plans to overthrow the Constitution and create a dictatorship, and to use his election as a means to do that. He plans to do something similar to what Hitler did, in Germany. Since Biden actually knows this, doesn't he have a duty to arrest him now and prevent it from happening? Doesn't he have a duty to insist that Trump's name be taken off all the ballots? An important question.
The concern arises if you get a president that staffs with people who will just do whatever he says.
And that is exactly what Trump is threatening to do. Trump is saying he's going to fill the civil service with his loyalists, with people who are loyal only to him and not to the Constitution, with people who are going to take the oath of office, swearing loyalty to the Constitution, with every intention of accepting their first loyalty to Trump and not to the Constitution.
That's the concern. One of the other concerns about this is that it distracts from the reality. There is no magic scenario that makes this go away. There's no savior. It's you. It's you.
That is absolutely right. In the end, it's whether the voters accept, the legitimacy of whatever Biden chooses to do, or whatever Trump chooses to do, or whatever the Supreme Court has just done. Will the voters accept that? Or will they go gently into that good night without raging against the dying of the light?
This has to be defeated at the ballot box.
Yes.
That's where it has to be stopped.
It has to be stopped, at the ballot box. But what if Biden were to take actions to ensure that this was a strictly fair election? We have the history of the 2020 election, where Trump's Confederates, his loyalists, did all kinds of things to try to overturn, the result, of the election. And I grant there are many people who still think that the 2020 election was a rigged election in favor, of Biden, and that it was Biden's people, who rigged it, and the Trump people were only fighting them. I'm not in a position to determine whether that was true or not, but I am in a position to say that the actions that were being taken by Trump's people were not legal and were not constitutional. They were trying to use all kinds of mafia-like means in order to overturn, the results of the election. Now, they will tell you that they have as a rationale the fact that the election was rigged. But there's a widespread amount of disagreement on that. Okay, but if Biden did everything he could, including use of his new immunity to ensure, okay, that this election was free and fair, what if he ordered in federal troops across all the country to monitor the polls and to ensure that there were no MAGA influences, okay, at the polls? People might consider that an unconstitutional use, okay, of his authority. But what if it was all honest, okay, and up, okay, in the sense that all the military people had orders to ensure that there was free and fair elections at the polls with no intimidation at all, okay, of voters, that they were just there to ensure everyone's safety and to ensure that there was no bullying, okay, at the polls. Would Biden be wrong to do that? And would the people he ordered, okay, to do that, would they believe that the orders, okay, were illegitimate? He might feel free to do it because he couldn't be held accountable, okay, in a court of law. But beyond that, other people might accept that he had the authority to do it, even if he doesn't, because his intentions were good and because the outcome was good, that it was a free and fair election and was not rigged. So should Biden be doing that? Or should he be viewing the Constitution as a suicide pact? What do you think?
There isn't a magical procedural motion or anything like that that is going to alter that. The United States, the type of representative democracy that exists in this republic, requires advanced citizenship.
I completely agree. Now, the advanced citizen knows that the Constitution only helps those who help themselves. Consider that for a minute.
If it is to continue, it has to be defeated at the ballot box.
Yeah.
Even AOC's move, she's saying she's going to file articles of impeachment. I have questions about it, but as far as it being effective, it won't be.
He is absolutely right about that. She's suggesting a constitutional amendment. First of all, you've got to pass it, and you've got a House controlled by Republicans. Is this going to pass? No, this is a performative gesture by AOC. It doesn't help at all. It's just her performative gesture. Oh, let's pass a constitutional amendment. Never happened. Even if it were to happen, it would take 7 years for all the states to ratify it, maybe more. I think Donald Trump's going to be long dead by then. And so is Joe Biden.
Unless there is a defeat of authoritarianism at the ballot box. Let's say she files the articles of impeachment and it makes it through, and then it goes through the Senate, and some Supreme Court justices get removed. If the American people do not show up at the ballot box, well, Trump might just reappoint them.
Yep, he absolutely might. And Justin's completely
There
correct.
isn't a scenario that doesn't require your participation on voting day. It's the reality of it. So I get that most people are joking. Just don't let the joke become something that is seen as a realistic possibility, because that's not going to alter this. It's going to be you. Anyway, it's just a thought. Y'all have a good day.
Okay, Bo is a very wise man, if any of you have watched him before. And he lets out his wisdom in very short bursts. This video was only 4 minutes, okay, and 49 seconds. And it was worth 4 hours and 49 minutes of time, certainly. But the bottom line is Trump will only be beaten at the ballot box. The Supreme Court will only be beaten at the ballot box. Specifically, what needs to happen, what needs to happen, is that we vote for a Congress in November of 2024 such that none of the candidates we vote for are supportive of Trump or are supportive of the Supreme Court. They have to be people who are opposed to the kingly presidency, they have to be people who are willing to legislate against the Supreme Court. Why is this necessary? Because what Biden can do is between the entrance of the new Congress on January 3rd of 2025 and Biden's exit on January 20th of 2025. There are 17 days to pass a law that contains within it the exceptions clause of the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, prohibiting review of the legislation by any appellate courts, including the Supreme Court. And that particular legislation can simply negate specifically the immunity that was given to Trump and that was given to Biden himself by this Supreme Court. That is, legislation can simply declare there is no immunity for the president. If the president commits a crime, he can be prosecuted at any time. He can be prosecuted during his presidency. He can be prosecuted after his presidency. This legislation has to dispel the distinction between official acts and unofficial acts. Everyone must be equal before the law, including the President of the United States. It has to enshrine the principle that no one is above the law, including and especially the President of the United States. It has to emphatically state that this country is not, a monarchy, that it doesn't value the actions of the President of the United States in such a way that the President of the United States is immune to crimes that he or she commits. In other words, the Supreme Court's decision has to be rejected by the Congress of the United States, and the Supreme Court has to be prohibited from reviewing this particular legislation by including the key clauses, key words of Article 3, Section 2 inside of the legislation. That's what has to be done. Between January 3rd and January 20th, there were also a number of other laws that Congress and the executive should pass. All of them should have the exceptions clause in them. But the Hobbs decision should be rejected in one of those laws. The decision that was just taken that got rid of Chevron deference needs also to be nullified. The Citizens United case of 2010 also needs to be nullified. And there are 3 or 4 other decisions made by the Supreme Court that have to be nullified by that Congress. Between January 3rd and January 20th. If Biden should happen to run and win, and I hope he doesn't, I hope he withdraws, at this point. But whether he does or not, these things should be done while he is still president and while a new Congress full of non-Republicans takes office on January 3rd of 2025. So, yes, we have to do it. We have to do it at the ballot box. There are no saviors except ourselves. As Bernie Sanders was fond of saying, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And that's especially true in this case. We have to take things in our hands. And with these hands, we have to reject this transformation of the United States into an oligarchy led by a dictator. We have to take our democracy back with these hands. And thank you, Nina Turner, for that phrase. I did intend to go over a very good article from the Washington Post, but I think I'm going to leave that for tomorrow night or Friday. I'm not yet sure whether I will have a stream, tomorrow night. If I don't have one tomorrow night, though, I will have one on Saturday. Tomorrow, of course, is the 4th, and I will be celebrating to some degree. I will be celebrating the independence of the United States and celebrating the need to keep it independent, not just from foreign powers, but from the internal enemies of the United States, such as Donald Trump, and anyone who would convert this country into a tyranny. I know all the arguments against what Joe Biden has been doing. I make those arguments very often, myself. I think Joe Biden has brought us closer dictatorship in various ways. I've made that case many times. I will continue to make it. But at this juncture, it is important for us to act, to give Joe Biden a new Congress, to get the Republicans out of the equation, and to give Joe Biden a chance to pass these various laws that will nullify the damage that the Supreme Court has done to the United States in recent years. All that damage needs to be nullified. It can be nullified in a frantic 2 weeks if we give Biden an overwhelming majority in the Senate and the House, okay, to work with. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm not asking for Democrats. I'm asking for non-Republicans. Okay, if you want to vote for Green Party candidates, that's fine. Okay, if you want to vote for some of the other third parties, for Robert Kennedy, that's fine. As long as you want to vote for congressional candidates who are supporting the Constitution, that's fine. That's what Biden needs to get these laws passed. And between now and then, we need to make the case to Joe Biden for this kind of activity, for emergency activity to nullify what the Supreme Court has done to the United States in recent years. Starting with the Citizens United decision of 2010. And healing all the damage that has been done since then, including the creation of a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, which means that during that 2-week period, there would have to be a law passed, again, unreviewable by the Supreme Court using Article 3, Section 2, which increased the number of justices on the Supreme Court by 6, so that there was a 9-6 anti-conservative group sitting on the Supreme Court when all was said, and done. So I'm going to end it there for tonight. I have to go over the deed to help her. I'll cover the Washington Post article, at a later time. I am going to go through your comments quickly. The Squirrely Prepper Lifestyle said hello. And Biden needs to save us and use that immunity. He certainly does. Project 2025 is like the fall of Rome. Yes, he has to look at this also as stopping Project 2025 in its tracks. Squirrely Prepper Lifestyle says destruction of central political power. Yes, we need central political power. We do. Squirrely Prepper Lifestyle says resistance to the Trump regime. Steve Wolfbrand says Biden has dementia and Doc has Trump derangement syndrome. No, I don't, Steve. I really resent that. How can you claim that that's a real thing when Trump is threatening, to become a dictator? When Trump has been threatening to do it for a long time. When Trump plans to implement Project 2025. These are real dangers. They're not my imagination. They are real. You are the one who is being unrealistic here. You are the one who has, I don't know what to call it. It's not, you have the true Trump derangement syndrome. which is to believe that he would not do these things. Robert Copeland says, almost every politician that I voted for in the March primary lost to big money from big corporations. Supreme Court should have term limits. Yeah, the Supreme Court should have term limits. I certainly agree. I think life appointments are too much. It's supposed to place them above the fray of politics. But has it worked to do that? We have the lifetime appointments of the 6 conservatives, 3 of whom have been getting bribed wholesale by billionaires. If we had term limits, we wouldn't have Sam Alito as a justice of the United States. We wouldn't have Clarence Thomas as a justice of the United States. If the term limits were short enough, even John Roberts wouldn't be a justice right now. So yeah, I think term limits are certainly worthwhile, but also there should be heavy penalties for justices who take bribes, like these justices have been doing. I mean, Roberts, Sam Alito, Clarence Thomas should all go to jail for taking bribes. Now, if Biden would have clapped them into jail at this point, using the new powers he was given by them, there would be a certain delicious irony to that. Of course, it would be an illegal thing to do because there's no law saying they cannot take bribes, unfortunately. That's one of the laws that should be passed between January 3rd and January 20th, by the way. Yes, the Supreme Court should have term limits. On that note, I'm going to say goodnight. Oh, by the way, before you all leave, please hit the like button, because on my indicator here, I see there are only 2 likes today, but there are 25 of you, which is pretty good attendance this particular stream. And you've been here for a long time, so all that is very good. I want to thank you anyway. I'm going to go over to Around the World with Dee and Friends now to help Dee out with her show. So good night. I may see you tomorrow night, but if not, I'll see you on both Friday and Saturday.